Welcome to the Ty Beal Show, where we discuss food, science, and life. I'm Ty Beal, a scientist at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, or GAIN. My guest today is Dr. Anne Mottet, an agro-economist and global lead for livestock at the International Fund for Agricultural Development, or IFAD. Dr. Mottet oversees the technical quality of $1 billion in investments and has over 20 years of experience in research and international development. In our conversation, we talk all about livestock and how it impacts our planet. A quick note before we start. This podcast is separate from my role at GAIN. All right, let's get started. Anne, it's great to see you. Welcome.
Hi, Ty. Thank you for having me.
So we've conducted research together.
We did.
But I've never really heard your story. How did you get interested in livestock?
Well, actually, I'm an agronomist by training, some 25 years ago. But I've always worked on farms and systems that include animals, and I've always looked into the environmental impacts of the animals. So first as a researcher, and then later on with the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and for the last 2 years with IFAD.
Great. Well, I really admired your work. I've followed it for many years, and it was great to work on that joint paper we wrote together a couple of years ago. We can talk about that later on. But before we dive in, I have to know, what is it like being married to an astronaut?
That's an interesting question. I did not expect that one. Well, it's not without challenges. My work is very grounded. His work is grounded in other aspects. We don't have the same geography at all. So now I work for the United Nations in low and middle income countries. They usually don't have a space program. So his geography is very different from mine. But he also comes from a family with a lot of farmers, just like me. So he understands what I'm doing, and this is we find a common ground sometimes.
Okay. Well, you're both very successful. It's very cool to see you figuring that out and working together. So, we're going to talk about the environmental impact of livestock. And for the listeners, can you let us know, what are we talking about when we say environmental impact? What is it about the environment? What are the different areas that we care about?
So yeah, that's important to start with that. So the environment, this has to do with, for example, land, because the biggest point with livestock is that it's using a lot of land, and it drives everything else. So because there's a lot of land involved, there's also a lot of water. But it has also to do with climate change. We hear a lot about the greenhouse gas emissions from the livestock sector, in particular methane. I'm sure a lot of people have heard about this. So it's also about climate change, but it's also about biodiversity. The land and the biodiversity, whether animals, insects, plants, that has a lot to do with the environmental impact and also benefits of livestock. And maybe we can discuss a little bit also how we can improve that, optimize all these impacts to improve the positives and reduce the negatives.
Okay. There's different areas. There's land, there's water, there's climate, there's biodiversity. So let's talk about these each so that listeners can kind of hear what is the role of livestock in these different areas, and where are they having an impact, and where can that be improved? So, livestock get a bad rap for their impact on our planet, of course. A lot of people are choosing not to eat meat or animal products because of that, or to reduce their consumption in wealthy countries, that is. So just to start about land and land use, can you tell us what percentage of global land is used for agriculture and livestock altogether? Just a rough figure here.
Yes, absolutely. So when I was in FAO some 5 years ago, we did a global assessment of how much land is needed for the global livestock sector. What we found is that it's significant. So if you divide the Earth in three shares, basically, I mean the emerged land, not the entire Earth, because we have 70% of water. But if you take the land, you divide it by three. 1/3 is about forests, 1/3 is agriculture, and 1/3 is other things, urban areas, but also bare soils, glaciers, and so on. So in the third that is occupied by agriculture, in our study, we estimated that about half of this was used by livestock, which is a bit less than what is usually reported. And this is because we went into more details than just looking at land cover from remote sensing, from satellite data. And out of this, about 20% of emerged land that we considered was used by livestock, there's a big share that is actually grasslands and pastures, and a smaller share that is arable land.
Okay. So about a third, when you say agriculture, you're really talking about the crops, the plants that are produced for food, as well as livestock. So a third, and about half of that is around 15 to 20% for livestock. So when we're thinking about that 15 to 20%, what proportion could be converted to farmland? I think a lot of people might be thinking, okay, well, why don't we just reduce the amount of livestock? Let's just take this land we have and make it, use it for crops or other purposes. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, absolutely. So indeed, I mean, if we use the land in the most efficient way for nutrition, for health, for the environment, we need to consider what can be directly cropped and what is not croppable, arable. So what we estimated in that study back then in FAO was that about 10%, so half of this land used by livestock, could not be used for anything else because it's constituted of rangeland and pastures where the depth of the soil is too thin, or where the slopes are too steep for cropping, or that has a too short croppable period. So that means the biomass can only grow over 1 or 2 months in the year. So all this land, about half of what livestock is using, cannot be cropped and has no alternative in terms of use. But then the other half could be cropped, and some of it is already cropped because livestock is using arable land as well directly. So there is an opportunity cost here to consider, and there are progress to be made to make sure that we optimize the land that cannot be used otherwise for livestock, and that the land that we can crop, we can crop directly and feed humans directly.
Wow. So what I'm hearing is about half of that land that is currently used for livestock could be converted to cropland or farmland, but half of it, for whatever reason, maybe it's too steep, it's too rocky, the growing season's too short, many different reasons, it can't really be converted. So there's not really any agricultural use for that land. How about other uses of that land? What would happen? I'm just trying to think about this practically or hypothetically. If you were to remove livestock from this land that is too steep, or the soil's not right for crops, it's too rocky, whatever reason, if you take the livestock off the land, what impact is that going to have? Is that the same everywhere? Is there a different story depending on the context? Does it depend on what what is replacing that livestock?
Yeah, that's a good question. And of course, the answer is not simple. So yes, it depends on the context. If you take temperate areas, for example, let's start with Europe. It's an area that I know well. If you take those mountains areas in Europe where we used to have more livestock, the Pyrenees, the Alps, even the Ural in further east, we have a decreased number of animals there. So we have a little bit of a lab vision of what could happen in those circumstances. And what we see is that there's a lot of encroachment. So something like natural afforestation, but it's usually monospecific, meaning only one type of tree is growing. So in the Pyrenees, it's ash tree, or you have some ferns as well. So when this land that used to be grazed is abandoned in such context, then you have nature coming back, but not in a very diverse way. Usually only one or two species take advantage of that, and it's not particularly for the benefit of biodiversity, for example. In other contexts, you could have more diverse reforestation or return of nature, but it's usually not as diverse as when you have a little bit of grazing and other uses around. So when it comes to biodiversity, for example, the optimum is usually a mix of usage, a mosaic of ways of using the land. The reason behind this is because a lot of the world has been managed by humans for a long time. So when you remove one driver of that, and usually it's a lot of livestock in these areas, you bring some sort of unbalance in the system, and it's not always a desirable outcome.
Wow. That's really interesting to think. It's not simple. You don't just take the livestock away, remove the pastoralist or whoever is, raising that livestock and have it turn into this beautiful biodiverse ecosystem, right? So I'm hearing that in some contexts, like in Europe, there can actually be some negative effects. Forest encroachment, you said single species, so not a diversity of trees and shrubs and everything, but actually less biodiversity, which I think is fascinating to think about. And then other contexts where it may come back in a diverse way. So there are opportunities depending on where you are. I'm curious about this. What is it about grazing? What is it about these livestock or these ruminants, which are really these animals that digest grasses, shrubs, forbs, etc.? What is it about them that is helping with biodiversity in some contexts?
Yes, so the reason behind is we're still in the context of those land that cannot be cropped. So we usually those areas, they're called marginal land. So there are areas where there's not a really good there's no real good agronomic conditions to grow anything. So it can be the weather, it can be the amount of water that falls, it can be the depth of the soil again, how many the amounts of rocks in the ground. All this makes it more profitable and interesting also from the natural point of view to graze. And before the livestock, you in many contexts you actually had wildlife grazing. So what makes it optimum with herbivores or ruminants is that you cannot grow high density biomass for energy like cereals, but very small types of grass or shrubs or legumes that are not worth collecting. You cannot really. It's a lot of work for humans to collect and make anything out of it. But animals, they are mobile, and it's their biology, the nature to actually graze this biomass and turn it into something that we can eat, like milk and meat. That's because they digest this grass and we cannot. So for us, if we collect the grass, we cannot do much with it, but for them, they can transfer this fiber that we cannot digest as humans into digestible products. So they are a little bit like a converter of this marginal biomass, and it's close to the optimum way of using this area if we want to continue feeding humans. The point is also that these areas, they're still very important for a lot of people. It's not just national parks and reserves that we can think about from our desks in big cities. They're actually areas where a lot of people live and they depend on those animals for their food, but also for their income. So this is important to keep in mind as well.
Wow, fascinating. I know that there are these native grazers, like you said, in many contexts, and it varies depending on where you are. In North America, where I live, it was the bison, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we had, I think, 50 million by some estimates bison in the Great Plains of North America before Europeans came and kind of destroyed that source. So it sounds like the role really is ruminants and these animals that graze, they are part of the ecosystem. And if they're not removed in a careful way, or if they're removed when there should be something there can be a negative impact. That's what I'm hearing. I sort of saw this firsthand. I toured some ranches in South Texas, and I saw how fragile the ecosystems were, how diverse, full of butterflies and insects and all sorts of plants. And if the livestock are removed, that soil quality would actually be destroyed or reduced. And so there can be these, I know in the prairies in the North America as well, many of these ecosystems without some form of grazing would not be as well off. So it sounds like there's really a lot of nuance in this. Sometimes it is possible to remove livestock and maybe reforest or create a natural ecosystem, but it's not always that simple. That's what I'm hearing.
That's true, and I think it applies. I mean, we've talked about Europe, North America, but it also applies to the savannas in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. And in that case, the megafauna, as we say, or the large herbivores, they disappeared way before the bisons in North America, and there was this period without this megafauna, and then the livestock was brought in more recently and is still increasing, and the same mechanism applies at different time scale. Obviously, it's also true in the big steppes of Central Asia, large mountains area of Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan. A lot of these areas are under the same dynamic. It's true also in the extreme south of South America, for example, in the Pampas. So this dynamic in extensive grazing systems and marginal land we find pretty much everywhere in the world.
Wow. It's so fascinating that these ecosystems, many of these are kind of considered grasslands, or you're calling them marginal lands, they evolved with animals.
They do.
And now humans have, in many of these contexts, humans have grazed these animals. And so it's really interesting to see the role that, ruminants or livestock like beef, cattle, and others are really playing in these ecosystems. So now, one of the big issues with livestock, and I think probably most of the population in the US and in other kind of wealthy contexts, when we think about livestock, especially beef, they think this is a climate issue. We're really concerned about the climate, global warming, methane. If they're more involved, maybe it's methane emissions. So this climate concern is important, and we know that the climate has been changing and been warming. And so can you tell us a bit about, first of all, how do we think about climate in the context of livestock? What are these emissions that we're talking about? We hear this term greenhouse gas emissions. Can you give us a little bit more detail about what are those emissions and how do we measure this climate issue?
Yeah, so when we talk about climate change in the context of agriculture and especially livestock, we always say, first, on the one side, there are the emissions. So the emissions that actually contribute to this problem of climate change. And on the other side, there's what we need to do to adapt to the changing climate. So let's start with the emissions, but it's important to remember that, farmers, especially poor livestock keepers in the world, they are the ones that suffer the most from climate change. And usually in a lot of countries, they were not responsible for that. Industrialized countries contributed the most.
Wow, let me just restate that for people to hear. The people who typically suffer the most or the most impacted by climate change are those who did not cause the climate change.
That's correct.
That's what I'm hearing. Those in these more lower resource settings.
That's correct.
Okay.
Especially those farmers we just mentioned in marginal areas that constitute a large share. Remember we said about 10% of the emerged land. So those people, they live in the Sahel, in Central Asia, in South America, and they are very much exposed to climate change, to drought, to dust winds, flooding, all the sorts of impact you can find, and they did not really contribute. But we can come to this. How do they adapt afterwards, but we can talk
Sure.
about those emissions first. So the emissions, they usually we hear about carbon, right? So it's carbon dioxide, CO2. This is the gas that in the atmosphere traps heat and acts like a greenhouse and makes the climate different, not only in terms of temperature but also precipitation, hurricanes, and so on. So we have CO2, carbon dioxide in agriculture, like in other sectors, a bit less. For example, transports. When you burn fossil fuels, you have a lot of CO2 that is released in the atmosphere. In agriculture, there's a bit of CO2, but it's not emitted directly except when you turn a grassland into a cropland, for example. So remember, we were talking about this land that is grazed by animals and that we could turn into crops to produce food that humans can eat directly. Well, we need to consider that if we do that, we're changing an ecosystem and we are releasing carbon from the soils, but we're also changing the biodiversity and so on. So there's always a compromise to be made. But the gases in agriculture that are the most important are nitrous oxide and methane. And they are due to what we call biogenic mechanisms. So a lot of this is, for example, microbes, bacteria, fungi that digest biomass, whether biomass from manure that is released from the animals or biomass that ruminants consume and have in their stomachs, and it's digested by those microbes, and then they release methane in the form of burps. So all these emissions they come from mechanisms that involve microbes in agriculture in different places in the crop fields, in the gut of the animal, and so on.
Okay, so these two gases I'm hearing are methane and nitrous oxide.
Yes.
I think some people will be surprised to know that the cattle burp this methane. It's not farting.
It's not farting. It's burping 95%.
Okay. So these have, what do these gases do? They warm the atmosphere. How does that work?
So exactly, they act like CO2, the carbon dioxide, but even a bit more, because a molecule of nitrous oxide or methane traps more heat than a molecule of carbon dioxide. So that's why we often hear about carbon dioxide equivalents. We convert nitrous oxide and methane into CO2, and in doing so, we say 1 ton of methane that is released in the atmosphere traps about 27 times more heat than CO2 over a 100-year period. So we do those equivalents to try and estimate the impact of those gases on climate change.
Okay, and can you tell us a little bit about sort of the lifespan of these gases? Is it the same with these different gases? Do they last in the atmosphere the same amount of time?
So that's a good question. For nitrous oxide, that's not really an issue, but for methane, it's very different, because methane lasts about 12 years in the atmosphere. After 12 years, so methane, the molecule is CH4. So it has carbon just like carbon dioxide. And in the atmosphere, it degrades into CO2 after about 12 years. So it traps a lot of heat when it's released, but after a while, it just degrades. So if we want to have a good impact on climate change, we need to reduce methane in the short term, because that's when we're going to have a huge impact on basically cooling down a little bit the planet.
Okay, so for the most immediate returns, methane is a really powerful lever. If
It
we
is
can
a very
reduce the amount of
powerful
methane. Okay, and then longer term, it sounds like we really need a better solution of reducing overall CO2, because that's going to remain in the atmosphere for much longer.
If we focus on methane only, we will not solve it. It's basically we cannot think that we can just stop eating meat and continue driving 2 cars per household, and this would be okay. We have to do both, addressing the methane, including livestock, and the CO2 from transport.
Okay, so it sounds like there is a big concern with the amount of methane and overall greenhouse gases from livestock. Can you tell us, in the grand scheme of things, with all the other sectors, what are the largest contributors to these emissions? Is agriculture and livestock the biggest issue that we're facing today?
So agriculture and livestock are one of the biggest. The transport industry is also contributing to methane. So there is it's a bit less, but it's about the same order of magnitude. Landfills are also a good contributor to a second level, a lesser extent, I would say, because there's also organic matter that decomposes in landfills in anaerobic condition, meaning in conditions where there's no oxygen, and this is when you get methane. So yeah, transport and landfills are also an issue for methane.
Okay, now thinking more broadly about just overall greenhouse gas emissions, what other sectors contribute? How about the energy sector or others? How do they compare to the overall contribution from agriculture or livestock?
So it's difficult to there are different ways of looking at this. If you take I don't know if everyone is familiar with the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's a very large group of researchers in the world that work for the UN. I mean, that contribute to UN assessments on greenhouse gas emissions, and they have a way of reporting emissions, and countries report to them for these global assessments to be produced regularly, and they look at sectors. So they take industry and transport and energy and then land use and land cover and forestry, including agriculture. So when you look at this, there's a share in agriculture is between 20 to 25% over time. And energy and industry are basically the rest. So all the other sectors are the rest. If you look at an assessment that we did more recently, when we tried to correct a little bit a misconception that the livestock sector emitted more than the transport sector. That's a big misconception. We looked at what we call life cycle, meaning we don't only look at these emissions from the cattle that are burping and the manure, but we also include the emissions from their feed. So if you planting maize or soybeans to feed your cattle, we also included those emissions. And we also included the emissions from the fertilizers for these crops, and from transporting the meat and the milk and the eggs after you produce them. So that's what we call life cycle, everything that contributes to making the product available. In an assessment from 2013, we estimated that livestock value chains were about 14% of all emissions in the world, if you take a life cycle assessment. And this was compared to transport only at the time, that was about 5%. But the 5% was not life cycle, it was this sectorial IPCC approach. So it was just looking at the transport sector burning fuel. Planes burning fuel, cars burning fuels, and boats burning fuels. But it did not include emissions for building those vehicles, or for extracting this fuel, or for disposing of the old vehicles. So there was a false comparison at the time that compared a life cycle to a sector. And when you actually look at the life cycle of transport, there's no such figure at global level. I don't know why no one calculated that. Maybe no one has any interest in doing that, especially the ones who are part of the, either the fossil fuel industry or the companies that build vehicles. But the fact is, we don't have this figure at global level. We only have it at country level for the US, for China, for a few other countries. And it could be about 30% higher than just direct emission. So that means you would increase the life cycle emission of transport, and then you would compare two things in an equivalent way. But, and to make it even more complicated, in the life cycle emission of the livestock that we mentioned, 14%, there's already some transport because we said, we included emission from transporting the meat and the milk.
Right.
So how do you compare something where to transport where you would be double counting, basically? So that's why it's very difficult to compare. Overall, we can say the safest conclusion is agriculture is a significant contributor, and we need to work on reducing that. But alone, it won't solve the problem of climate change, and we should continue prioritizing the other sectors, the ones that are based on fossil fuels and that are linked to, activities like transport, industry, and so on.
Wow. So to sort of get a simple picture here, energy industry, other sectors contribute a lot, but agriculture, including livestock, still contributes a big amount of these greenhouse gas emissions, up to about a quarter. So what I'm wanting to know, and I think people want to know, is what do we do about that? Can we address this issue while still producing livestock? Should we reduce the amount of livestock? Should we change the types of livestock? Does the way that we produce livestock affect this? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's a bit of everything you mentioned. So there are ways of reducing the emissions and keeping the same amount of food. And this depends on how and where the food is produced, including in livestock. There are ways of limiting what we waste already, and making our food system more efficient. We know that we waste a lot of food, especially in rich countries at consumer level, but also in all countries at production level because of pests and diseases. A cow that is sick is a waste of resources. It's not only a loss for the farmer in terms of income, but it's also a waste of resources. This cow has eaten biomass and released methane and is not leading to any product. So that's also part of waste and loss that we can reduce and overall, make more food with less impact. And we estimate that about a third of the food produced at global level is wasted or at consumer level or lost along the supply chain.
Wow.
It has also to do with retail. We tend to standardize a lot the products. A tomato has to be round and red, and if it's not, then we discard it because it's not pretty and nobody's gonna buy it. This is just wasted food. So it happens also at retail level. So if we start first by reducing this waste and loss, we reduce the impact. But in the production of the food and in the processing of the food, we have many ways of improving the efficiency and making it basically reducing emissions and keep the same amount of food.
Okay, so that's a pretty huge number. You said a third of food is lost or wasted. So there's a huge sort of lever in terms of improving our food loss and waste. That's at the farm level, that's at the consumer level, right? And then I'm also hearing that production efficiency, so how much can you produce with the amount of animals you have, plays a big role. And so there's a lot of opportunity to increase that. So we can talk a little bit more about the solutions later on. But I want to shift into biodiversity because that is something that I think a lot of people care about. And it really has to do with the animals and the plants that live on this planet. And so that, if we think about all of the impacts of food production, of livestock, the animals and life on our planet, the plants on our planet, that is pretty critical. Can you tell us about biodiversity and how do livestock influence this biodiversity?
Yes, of course. So the biodiversity is, let's first say what we consider biodiversity in the discussion here. For me, it's not only emblematic animals like endangered species. We're talking about first the agricultural biodiversity. So all the breeds and the species of crops that we grow, all the trees that we benefit from. We start with that, but then it's also the biodiversity that we don't see, the microbiome. All the bacteria and fungi that are again in the soil or in the rumen of the animals, in the stomach of the animals, that allow them to digest. So this biodiversity is very large, and we know that we're losing biodiversity. It happened in the past because of the ice age or so on, but now it's happening. It's just like climate change. It's happening at a faster rate because of human activities. And the more we lose biodiversity, the less tools we have to feed ourselves and to adapt to climate change or adapt to crisis. And because we depend on very few species and varieties, and they become very, very vulnerable. If you have 10 different crops in your garden, one or two may fail, but you still have the other ones. If you put everything on wheat and maize and soy, then you're equipped with very little, and you're not very resilient, you're very vulnerable. It's the same with livestock. If we only grow Frisian cows, black and white dairy cows everywhere in the world, they might suffer a lot from heat stress in some countries. They might not be resistant to some diseases in some countries that are endemic, and we are very vulnerable. So for me, the biodiversity is all this, the one that we manage and the natural one, including the one we don't see. And livestock has impact on all of this. For example, livestock we already talked about climate, and climate change impacts biodiversity a lot. With higher temperatures, the mix of species and varieties in a grassland, in those marginal areas that we talked about, changes because they're not all adapted to the same temperature or the same amount of water. So you see a switch from a mix to another mix that might not be as interesting and as good for grazing animals as they used to be. There's also impact of climate change directly on biodiversity in terms of how disease vectors propagate. So there used to be diseases that were confined to some part of the world, and because temperature increases, the vectors, for example, mosquitoes or little insects that carry this disease, they go further and further away, and they arrive in places where this disease did not exist, and now our animals are affected from disease from the other side of the world, and vice versa. So this is also an impact. But the livestock sector also impacts biodiversity through pollution or regulation of water quality. So if you have a very highly concentrated amount of animals in one area, they will release a lot of manure and urine, and there will be a lot of discharge of nitrogen and phosphate. So components, molecules that are very important for agriculture, for crops. But if you have too many of them, then it's not balanced, and it will not be absorbed by the plants, and it will arrive in surface water, in rivers, in basically in water, and it will contribute to water pollution, some phenomenon like eutrophication. So you can have green algae developing and basically invading water points because of this excess of nitrogen. But on the contrary, if you have a good amount of manure and a good stocking rate of the animals, you regulate the water quality because you have roots of plants benefiting from that, and they filter water, and you can have positive impact on water streams. So it's all about balancing the positive and the negatives again.
Okay, so I'm hearing that there's an impact from livestock that can be harmful if it's not, if these animals are not managed properly. There's too much of the waste that ends up into the water streams and can pollute, cause destruction, but they can be sort of managed in a way that helps the environment. Is that right? Am I hearing that?
Absolutely, yes.
Are livestock then, in these contexts where they're produced, is there always a way to manage them in a way that is sustainable, or is there sometimes is the solution, we need to probably not have livestock on this land?
I think there's no part of the world where you cannot have livestock. And if you think about it, there's no part of the world where humans arrived and didn't start or had already animals. The question is really how many and for how much resources that you have locally, and what you do with the manure, basically. So for me, it's really a question of stocking rates rather than some ecosystems, agro-ecosystems cannot have livestock. But when you say livestock, we need to think about again, biodiversity, all the types of animals. So in some cases, grazing animals are better because you have rangelands, pastures, all these marginal land that you cannot do anything else with. In some cases, it will be chicken and pigs because, for example, you have a very locally diverse agroecosystem, lots of different crops and a growing period that is very long. For example, around the tropics, all the mixed crop livestock farming systems around the tropics, where you have a large diversity. You have a lot of biomass to recycle. Household waste, for example, all the crop residues, the peeling from the vegetables, and so on. All these things, they can be recycled by being fed to chicken or pigs. So it depends on where and in which context. But there's always an optimum. It has to do with the number of livestock and the type of livestock to be adapted to the context.
Okay. I'm really interested to hear what you said at the start of that. Was really fascinating. So I heard there is really no area on Earth where animals should not exist. And you said that before humans arrived to these different areas, there were always animals. And so instead of thinking about this as, where should we have animals and should we remove them from the land, you're saying it's really about how do we manage these animals? What types of animals do we have on the land? And it's really about this attention to what is the local context. Is it really a natural grassland or rangeland that is more suitable to ruminants that graze because they evolved? That ecosystem evolved with those ruminants and those grazers, and the predators would sort of regulate their numbers, right? Now humans are playing that role if done inappropriately. In another context, it's other animals like pigs or chickens that may be more appropriate. So it sounds like there really is this need to understand and help change the narrative to not animals are bad or animals are good, have as much as you want, but really, how can we produce these animals that are beneficial to the biodiversity, that are at the right amount, the right number? It's an issue of scale. So there are a few other areas that we haven't touched on yet. So starting with soil, can you tell us why is soil health important, and how do livestock influence soil quality?
So soil is important because that's where we grow most of our food. And you remember when we worked together on that paper, we were trying to assess the amount of food that depends on soils, and some consider it's 100% because we don't have food produced outside of soil yet, but the big number we can keep in our mind is about 95% today. So everything we eat depends on soils, and soils mean the physical part of the soil, so the minerals, what kind of minerals you have, but also the organic part. So the organic meaning everything that decomposes from plant material like leaves that fall on the ground, or the manure you add, and so on. So that the physical and chemical aspect of the soil are what make them healthy. It's one of the biggest drivers, and livestock can make this better or worse. So by applying livestock manure, or just by parking your animals on the field crop during the night, you contribute to increase the organic matter in the soil. So adding basically carbon through the manure, but also nitrogen, all those chemicals that plants benefit from and will grow better with. And in that way, you can actually move the fertility around in your farm or in your ecosystem. Think about it. If you have animals grazing on top of a mountain during the day, you bring them at night to park them on your maize crop after the harvest, and you return some of this fertility that is collected in the mountain into an area where you concentrate your activity as a human for collecting all this. So you use the animals as a way to transport nutrients like carbon and nitrogen or phosphate, but also water through the urine into an area where you need higher fertility because it's close to your house and you need to apply more work to collect your crops. So this is a positive mechanism. But if you put too many of those animals, or if you have animals that don't go around to graze and are only concentrated in this area, and you actually bring the feed from other areas to them and they release the manure locally, then you have an accumulation of manure and it goes above what plants that you're growing on this field can absorb. And that's when it goes into the water, as we said earlier, and then it can contribute to pollution. So there's always, again, an optimum in terms of stocking rate. But it also has to do, and we cannot insist too much on that, on the microbiome. So all the microbes, the bacteria, the fungi that you find in the soil are very important to the soil health, and they contribute to help, like, to everything that we grow, and basically depend on those microbes. And the animals can add to this in a positive way, but they can also disturb this if with an excess of certain, for example, of nitrogen or other chemicals released to the manure. So there's also an optimum in terms of the life, the micro life that we don't see in the soil, that also is part of the soil health.
I'm noticing a theme here that it really depends. So it's not really this black and white, livestock are good for the environment, bad for the environment in these different areas. It really depends on how they're managed. Shifting to water, the amount of water, the quality of the water. Can you tell us what is the role of livestock in water?
Yes, of course. So we hear that producing meat in particular, but also milk, consumes a lot of water, and that is true, and that is mostly linked to the fact that if you look at global level, as we said at the beginning, livestock is using a lot of land. And a lot of this land is pastures. So the water that is used by livestock, when you do the calculation, and scientists have done this, and we have the figures now, there's part of it that is because you need to give water for drinking to the animals. That's true, especially in large confined systems. But most of it is actually the water that falls onto those pastures and rangelands, which is enormous because it's a very large part of the earth, as we said. And this water somehow would fall on those pastures anyway, whether you graze them with livestock or not. So the calculations show that about 90% of the water that we say are used by livestock is actually this green water, the water that is falling onto those pastures, and is not blue water, the water that you take from a stream to give to your animals for drinking or for cleaning the stable or so on. So it's important, but it's also to be put into the context of the land use, and again we can optimize this. We should reduce the water that is consumed for example, that is polluted through some processes, and that we need to clean afterwards to put back into the grid. But the water that falls onto these marginal land, we need to optimize as well through the grazing again.
Okay, so if the rain falls on the land, and there are livestock on that land, we say, All right, the livestock consume all of this water. That is the water being used. I'm surprised that that's included. It sounds
It
like
is. That is the crazy thing. I'm sure you heard this figure. For 1 kilogram of beef, you need 15,000 liters of water at global level. This is because if you aggregate all the beef in the world, a lot of this cattle is actually grown on pasture. It doesn't mean that feedlots don't consume too much water.
right.
But that's one part of the problem. A large share is actually from this beef that consumes grass where there's rainwater.
So yeah, that's fascinating, because if you remove the animals from the land, we don't save any water, do we? Does somehow that water...
In that case, not at all, no. The water would fall on the pasture anyway.
What about the ability of the land to sort of absorb and hold the water? This kind of relates to the soil health as well, but do livestock play a role in that, helping to maintain that land, or do they harm the land so that it doesn't retain as much water? How does that work?
Yeah, so this has to do with the physical property of the soil compared to the chemical that we already covered. So the physical capacity of water to absorb of soil to absorb water is super important, because it also has to do with the health, but also the threat to humans. If the water is not absorbed in the soil, then you can have flooding after heavy rains, for example, and then you can have we see that in the news every day, large flooding around the world. So that's super important for different reasons, not only for agriculture. And there are different ways that livestock can impact. So one is the compaction. So if you keep a lot of livestock concentrated in one area and they trample the soil too long, then the soil gets compacted. It's the same as if you have a heavy machinery like big tractors going around a field and compacting the soil. The water retention is decreased with that. On the contrary, if you have a system where you have trees and pastures together and the soil is aerated with the presence of the microbes that we mentioned, and the fauna like lombrics and so on, then there's a good retention as part of a grazing system, and the water gets absorbed better in the system and prevents runoff. So it depends obviously it depends on the type of soil. Some soils are better than others naturally to retain water, but also in those different types of soils you can optimize, and livestock can help store more water, but also too many livestock can contribute to compacting the soil and to reducing the retention.
Wow. Well, it's super helpful to hear about the complexity there. I want to shift to the last area that we often talk about, and you have sort of used this term, circularity, to describe a bit more of a holistic aspect of sustainability or of an environmental impact. Can you tell us what circularity is, and how does that fit into the livestock story?
Yes, so when we say circularity in agriculture of food systems, that's a big word where a lot of people put a lot of things, but basically how we produce our food, how it moves around, and what we do with it. We mean making sure that we reuse as much as we can from the waste. So it takes us back to this discussion of how much we waste of our food, and making sure that we recycle more through in particular the livestock. So there are two big ways we can do that with livestock. The first one is to make sure that every type of biomass that we would waste otherwise can be used as livestock feed. Instead of giving the grains or the soya or the maize to the animals, we give the straw, we give the bran, we give the leaves of beans, we give everything that us as humans we don't eat as livestock feed and fodder, instead of having it dried and wasted or used for construction material or whatever. So that's one way of making the food system more circular. And we know that this is already a practice in many parts of the world. We use soybean cakes, we use straw, we use bran, we use molasses as livestock feed, but we could do more. There's still a lot of this biomass that is wasted. If you think about it, when for example, take a plant that it's a plant where when you put tomatoes in cans, you get a lot of pulp and biomass from the tomatoes that is wasted, that ends up in cleaning water, and that you don't know what to do with it, or you have to recycle the water, and it's very costly. If you could dry this without too much energy and use this as livestock feed, you would waste less. That is true in a lot of processes in agri-food industry, in these plants that produce our food. But the reason that it's not done is sometimes because of regulation, because of feed safety. Just as for us, food safety, we want to make sure that the food is safe, is not contaminated. We do the same for feed in many countries, and we have strong regulation to ensure that the feed that goes in for the animals is not contaminated. So we need to look into that to make this biomass available. So there are ways to make this better. In Japan, for example, they changed the regulation, and they have incentives to make this happen. And the other way in livestock where we can do that better is with manure. So we already talked a lot about it, but a lot of the manure is used already as fertilizer, but also for biogas production, for example, to produce energy, as compost. But we can do more because there's still a lot of manure that is wasted or that is not used in an optimum way. We actually estimate that all the nutrients that we can find in livestock manure at global level, there's more than synthetic fertilizer, for example, in terms of nitrogen. So you find more nitrogen in manure at global level that you can find in what's available in synthetic fertilizer. But only a share of that is used. So that means we produce synthetic fertilizer where we already have this nitrogen somewhere and we're not using it. So optimizing the use of manure for nutrients and energy is another way of making livestock more circular.
I heard one of the things you were talking about was these tomato processing plants, and there's all this potential organic plant matter that is really a struggle for industry to process and either treat the water or figure out what to do with. There are distiller grains, there are crop residues, there's all sorts of other things that could potentially be used for livestock feed. Can you tell us, I've heard a lot of folks on sort of advocating for heavily plant-based diets say we should be composting all of this organic material, turning it into fertilizer for crops. Can you tell us what are the different approaches, composting versus feeding to livestock? Do those have trade-offs? Is one better than the other?
That's a good question. There are researchers that are looking into that in Wageningen University in particular. They're really looking into how much of the waste we can use as livestock feed and what the impact is for food system. I don't think. I mean, it's not a clear cut. Composting the plant waste is also a good idea. But we usually don't look into the impact on nutrition when it comes to that. So what you're going to use your compost for. So let's say you compost some manure or some, and you add some crop residues, and you have good compost to grow more crops. What is it you're going to grow, and what type of nutrition you get out of this? Because if you feed that to your animals, you're gonna get high quality protein. You're gonna get iron, calcium, zinc, all these nutrients that are very much lacking at global level. And you're the first one to know that. I mean, this is your area of specialty, and these are very much lacking. And with this biomass, you can add to the global balance of those nutrients that are very much missing. If you use this compost to produce some beans, then it can be interesting from the nutrition point of view. You may be lacking some of the nutrients. If you use it to produce potatoes, then it's not a lot of nutrition you get. You get kilocalories, but not a lot of nutrients. So those studies that look into what to do with the biomass at global level and how to optimize it really need to go into nutrition, because at the end of the day, we don't only eat kilocalories. We really need a diversity of nutrients, and this is one of the biggest issue at the moment in the world. We have more and more malnutrition, so nutrient deficiency. So for me, that the next step is, we can optimize, but what do we get out of it?
Right. It sounds like there's a lot of factors to consider here. And we've talked about so many different components just within environment, everything from land, climate, biodiversity, soil, water, and circularity. When we think about this together, most individuals, most of us are not thinking about, if I eat this food, the climate impact might be fine, but the water impact is a problem, right? People we're not thinking like that, right? So there's a sort of need to put it together to simplify. And I often hear from folks that, we should really be eating as much plant-based as we can and reducing livestock as much as we can. What would you say to people who ask this sort of question? Is it better to produce plants for human consumption as much as possible and reduce livestock as much? Is that a valid question to ask, and how would you answer it?
Yeah, I've been asked this question also, just like you, and from in my professional capacity, but also from my friends, and this is really a question that we hear in rich countries. It's important to say that in all the countries where I work with our projects with IFAD, it's not really a topic, because there is this question of food security and nutrition. So the answer also has to be placed in this context. From which perspective are we asking the question? If you're someone who has a good income and can choose what you eat, you by all means, get the information about the different products that are available to you and choose the best for you and the most virtuous in terms of environmental outcomes. This information is not always available, though. So, we're looking into labeling food in terms of planet scores or nutrient scores. This is a progress, but, when there are still issues, right? I mean, you don't always have the planet score next to the nutrient score. And then when you consider all indicators or criteria like water, as you said, land use, emissions, then it's not that easy. So yes, by all means, if you are informed and you get and you can have access to different types of food, choose the food in the best way. In a large part of the world, this choice is just not available. So we need to give the most nutritious food in the local context, in what's available. So I have a hard time for me with this question, because it's really a question that you can ask yourself if you're in a privileged situation.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense to me. But what about thinking about planetary boundaries, thinking about carrying capacity of the Earth, or sort of how much can we produce? I hear there's this difference where in low resource settings, in poorer context, where animal products are not consumed very much, it's not really a question. Nobody, we should not be trying to say don't eat more animal products or don't eat the ones you're eating. Maybe in wealthy countries there's room to moderate how much we eat. Is that part of the story? What is the overall ability of the planet to produce this? Because I think a lot of folks really care about how the meat is, the food is produced, how is the animal treated, how does that impact the environment. And I think people want to know, should I change what I eat? Should I make any different choices based on this?
I think it's a fair question. So if you're in this situation, I think you can really ask yourself, is my diet balanced already? How much of this meat do I consume? Do I have like 5 burgers a week? Then maybe you're eating a lot of meat, and you can consider reducing that. If you're eating meat every other day, you're probably not in if you're not eating 1 kilogram every other day, you're probably not in a very impactful diet in terms of plant versus meat. But I think there's definitely circumstances mostly in wealthy countries, and in some countries in what we call economies in transition, where a lot of people eat more and more meat, especially processed meat, where we can say, look, it might be good for a certain part of the population to limit their intake of meat. But I would say, even in this context, it's not only about meat. It's usually higher consumption of a lot of different products that are also not good for the environment and also not good for your health. So processed food in particular. So it's not really meat versus every other food. It's all types of different food that you need to balance. Plants are very virtuous in terms of environment and health in many contexts. Meat can be good and bad. Processed food is usually bad for everything. So it's more about I would say it's not meat versus the rest of the world. It's really a consumption habits. So the food industry being available to you because you instead of buying raw materials like vegetables and raw meat and milk and pulses and so on, you actually buy food that is ready-made, that can include a lot of meat, but also includes a lot of salt, a lot of supplements, and that cannot be good either for the planet or for your health.
Okay. It sounds like the focus really should be just about balance, about having the right kind of combinations of foods. So really not going too high in any of these products individually. And I also want to clarify, I think when you're talking about food processing, you're really talking about the unhealthy processing, because many foods are minimally processed in ways that are healthy, but you're talking about these kind of ultra processed foods. There's
Absolutely.
a lot of refined extracted ingredients, et cetera. A lot of people in the US and other wealthy countries may think, should I consume grass-fed meat and milk? Is that going to be better for the environment? Can you tell us about the difference between a conventionally raised, beef product in the US or Europe versus a grass-fed product? Is it better to buy the grass-fed? Is that going to have a better impact on the environment?
So yes, it can. The simple answer is yes, it can, but it's not systematically better. It also has to. I mean, we've been talking about all the different mechanisms, criteria to consider for environment. Grazing systems can be very virtuous in the sense that if they happen in places where you cannot grow something else, as we said, where you have the appropriate stocking rates, not to accumulate too much manure or too much trampling or too much biomass offtake from the animals. If it's balancing the biodiversity, yes, it has many. Grazing and grass-fed system has many ways it can be good for the environment. That is for sure. That doesn't mean it will be systematically. It can also be unbalanced, not managed in the right way, and it can also lead to environmental degradation if not managed in the right way. But at the same time, a non-grazing system can also be virtuous in certain contexts. So in the context of the United States, there's a big divide between grass-fed and feedlots. There are two very different systems and very much opposed in most of those criteria. So one is more extracting in terms of grazing what is there, and the other one is bring the biomass, bring the grain, bring the soybean to the feedlots, and then let's care about the manure afterwards, if at all. So there are non-grazing systems that are not feedlots that can also be very virtuous. And we talked about those mixed crop livestock farming systems where you have cereals, pulses, trees, and some animals, and they're together at the same in the same farm, and they're not grazing systems, but they're very virtuous because they're not having large environmental impacts. When you think about it, about 60% of farms in the world have some form of animals. So most farmers that grow crops also have animals on the side, and these specialized farms, livestock and crops is really something we find in a few countries only.
Fascinating. So I think I'm interested to know your take on this conventional, highly industrial process in the US where we have crops being grown for feed for livestock that are, of course, I think maybe not everyone knows this, but cattle, for example, are really grazed most of their life until the last 6 months, where they're sort of fed this in this feedlot state. But is it efficient? Is it effective to grow a bunch of crops for feeding livestock, or is that problematic intrinsically?
Yeah, I think it's a question of scale. At very large scale, there's a high chance it's not sustainable, because that means you will need very large amount of those crops. So you're going to grow them on very large areas in a monospecific way, meaning you only get one crop everywhere. So zero biodiversity at all, and lots of inputs like fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers, herbicides, insecticides, all those inputs that you need to manage everything that can destroy your crop, basically, and that would happen at large scale. And then on the end of the chain, you would have this large concentration of animals, so large areas where you need to bring a lot of water, because usually they're not farms that are close to large amounts of water available naturally. So you would need water for servicing the animals, and then you will need to get rid of the manure, transport it back to those crops, which is not really done currently. So the scale is really the issue. I mean, if you do that at the scale of a village, one side of the village is good for animals and the other side for crops, you can move things around and the scale is manageable. If you do that at the scale of a very large country, that's when problems become they start happening in terms of, again, water pollution, large amounts of nutrients, greenhouse gas emissions, lack of biodiversity, and so on.
Okay. Well, I know listeners may think, what type of product should I be consuming if I care about the environmental impact? And I've seen lots of studies that sort of compare replacing beef, for example, with another product like chicken or beans or something like that. Can you tell us, within animal products, is there a need to shift dietary patterns towards certain types of products?
So this we see happening indeed, for, I would say, actually more health reasons than environmental ones in wealthy countries. So we saw a shift in Europe and North America in particular, from red meat to poultry, to chicken, because of a perceived better impact on health, leaner meat, less fat, especially in women. And then, we also see one of the consequences is that you get less iron if you consume less red meat. So we also have, especially in women, iron deficiency linked to this change of behavior. So there's also a trade-off here. In terms of impact on the environment, yes and no. So again, I think the optimum is a balance between species and red meat, ruminant meat, and poultry in particular, because when you think about it, poultry would have a lesser environmental impact if the chicken consume basically recycle the material as feed, as we mentioned earlier. The highest amount of soybeans produced and consumed as feed is for poultry and pork. It's not cattle that is using the most of. I think it's over the 70 or 75% of the soybeans that are consumed, or the soybean cakes that are consumed at global level. They go for monogastrics, meaning chicken and pigs. They don't go for cattle. And these large areas of soybean that are necessary in some places of the world, they are associated with deforestation, for example, in the Amazonian in particular, or they are associated with the use of herbicides or GMOs or other, environmental concerns. So in that case, the feed, the impact of the livestock through the feed is higher in those systems, in those monogastrics, if they are using the soy instead of recycling other types of feed. So yes and no, it really depends on what you feed your animals with, how they are kept, what you do with the manure, and so on.
Okay.
It's better actually as a consumer. It's very difficult, but yeah, you the best is to know where the meat is coming from. If you're lucky enough to know a farmer and to have visited their farm, then it's probably the best situation for a consumer.
Okay. It's not easy for consumers. I think there's no easy way to say, okay, just consume this, consume these types of products, only buy, these ones with a label. So it sounds like we need to think a bit more in terms of, let's do the best we can. We want to obviously prioritize our health, our well-being, and the more that we can make decisions that are good for the environment, that's great. And I'm hearing that, pasture raised, some of these more grass-fed, circularly produced. Some people use the word regenerative agriculture, produced in more environmentally friendly ways, are better. Not having too much. It sounds like there's often trade-offs though. Like beef may have this high methane emission. They may use more land, and at the same time, they're using land that's often marginal and not available for other sources. And if they're managed appropriately, they're actually helping maintain biodiversity on the land. They're eating and converting these inedible plant foods into, human inedible plant foods into foods that humans can eat. While chicken may have lower emissions, but they're eating a lot of these crops, soybean crops that may be produced not in the most sustainable way. So I think maybe to relieve some pressure for consumers, have a balanced diet. I think trying to moderate, having a moderate amount of intake. In the US and in other wealthy contexts, we have a lot of privilege that we have choices for all sorts of different foods. I think what's really, concerning is that a lot of people can't choose that in different parts of the world. They want to eat more animal products and they can't access them, they can't afford them. So I want to talk a little bit about the other aspects we haven't touched on. We talked a little bit about nutrition, and we talked a lot about environment. What else are livestock important for? So we have livelihoods, culture, society. Can you tell us about these different areas and why are they important?
Yes, so that's a very important point because there's food, there's environment, and there's social aspects. So when I mean, it's gonna sound very naive, but if you go back in time, as humans, we've always been around animals, right? I mean, even in the Neolithic times, and even in very ancient times when we were drawing in caves, we were drawing animals as well, and we were hunting them, and then we started domesticating them, turning wolves into dogs, turning mountain goats into domesticated goats, and so on. So socially, we've always been around animals, and there are very interesting papers from the anthropology field looking into this relationship and how it evolved, and how what we're doing today as a society, looking into animals and saying they're bad for food, they're bad for nutrition, they're bad for your health, they're bad for the environment. It's a way of scapegoating and blaming this on the animals rather than questioning our own behavior. So socially, the animals have always been very important for us, as they were ways of accumulating wealth. They still are in a lot of places in the world where you don't have easily access to a bank account. It's changing now with mobile banking, but when you live in a remote area, and you're a small farmer, you don't have access to a bank account. How do you save your money if you don't want to put cash under your pillow? Well, you buy an animal, and then when you need the cash, you sell it. So it's a way of saving money. It's a way of it's a social status question as well. When you have a wedding, and then you bring an animal to the table to exchange with, or a large amount of animals, if depending on the context. That's also a way of saying, my status, my importance in this society is that much. But it's also super important for many other practical things during your lifetime. So, for example, animals are always used for transport. We have cars now, but in many, many areas, you still have donkeys and horses to transport things around. Also because cars cannot go everywhere. There are many areas that have no roads, especially in rural parts of the world. So you still need them for transport, and you need them also for plowing the land. You don't have tractors everywhere. I think the estimate is that about 50%, half of the arable land in the world, is still plowed without tractors, without a mechanized way. So it's either your hands or your animals. So that's a very large area. Maybe it's worth checking this estimate if it's still relevant. It might be. This is progressing obviously, but it's basically a very large amount. So yeah, you wouldn't have those crops without animal traction. That's basically the message. So yeah, I think socially and in terms of the day-to-day life in rural areas, animals are super important.
Yeah. Okay. And then the last sort of areas in sort of livelihoods, you said about savings. So that's really interesting to think that if you don't have access to savings, these animals are actually acting as your savings account. How many people are raising livestock for their livelihood? Do you know a rough number around the world so we can kind of get a sense for how many people depend on livestock for their income?
It's a good question and not an easy one to answer. So I can give you two figures. So the first one is we have about 700 poor people in the world, and more than half of them depend on animals. So about
700 million.
700 million
Okay.
under the threshold that are considered living in poverty. And more than half, about half a billion, 500 million, depend on livestock for their livelihoods directly. And then another figure is 1.4 billion people that depend directly or indirectly from the sector for their livelihoods, meaning they're not farmers, but they might be veterinarian in rural areas. They might be working in a dairy or in a milk collection center, or they might be milk collectors, or they might depend. There might be a small seed producers for maize for the livestock farmers. So and they have a family, and if you account for all the people of those families, it's about 1.4 billion people in the world. So it's pretty large. I would not be part of this 1.4 billion, even though I work on livestock, but that's a lot of people.
Yeah. Okay, that is a lot of people, 1.4 billion people who are sort of impacted by livestock for their livelihood. It's so clear, and from this conversation, that livestock have an important role in our society for a lot of different reasons, to produce nutritious foods that help contribute to health, to support people's livelihoods. And there's just a lot of potential harms from livestock and potential benefits, and we really need to work towards managing. I appreciate your work because you're sort of helping to manage and help address some of the challenges that we're facing, help improve the efficiency, help improve the sustainability, help improve the way that things are produced. So that's so helpful for our society. I wanted to just close by asking you, You've been in this field for 20 years. You've done a lot of research. You oversee huge amounts of funding programs from IFAD, around the world. What is the biggest misconception about livestock and the environment that you wish you could correct just once and for all? Maybe it's what people have asked you over and over again, or something you've seen reported.
Yeah, we talked about, there's livestock contribute more to climate change than transport. I mean, this one I've been trying to correct a lot, but that's not the one I would pick. The one I would pick is something you brought at the end of our conversation, is that for people to stop thinking, if I stop eating meat, and if I tell people stop eating meat, then we can solve the problem of climate change. We can solve the problem of biodiversity and so on. As you see in our conversation, it's way more complex than that, and it's simplistic messages never help. And for me, it's I would like to correct that. If I could contribute to people questioning a bit more, looking into where the food is coming from, rather than saying, if I stop this food, everything's going to be fine, then I would be happy.
Yeah, that's a great point. All food production has some sort of impact on our environment and our culture, and it doesn't need to be this black and white where it's all animal foods, it's all plant source foods. We really want to work towards balance and working towards shifting the way that animal foods are produced, the way that they're sort of consumed into healthy diets. So I couldn't agree more. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me, and I'm really looking forward to speaking with you again later and continuing to partner on this. Thanks so much, Anne.
Thank you, Ty, and thanks for having me. And I can return the compliment. Your work is very important for our work as well. It's we're switching more and more towards nutrition and not only food security. And the nuance that you bring through your work and in those podcasts are very important for us as well. So thank you for that.